Poetry is everywhere. Every culture, every society, and every country has produced poetry in one form or another. Creative minds throughout history have found ways to express their intricate thoughts, feelings, and emotions through beautiful word-based artwork that we call poetry. To quote the famous poet Robert Frost, "Poetry is when an emotion has found its thought and the thought has found words." What is so amazing about poetry is how versatile it can be, even in a group of like-minded individuals who all experience the same creative writing class together. What does poetry mean to you?
Poetry, while I don't read it often, is something that when I do read it, it's really interesting because it shows how good at somebody's craft they are and how diverse it can be, because you can have like 2 to 5 sentence poems to pages and pages, and it's really interesting to see.
I see poetry as a form of art that's like writing but is more visceral. It's written in such a way that could be metaphorical or could be very much in your face. As with normal writing, it stretches out metaphors and thoughts along long periods of time, whereas a poem is usually shorter and a lot more concise. A poem is, like, in my opinion, an easier to digest way to process emotions that another person is feeling. It's just another art form that, when written, can be extremely cathartic and concise, while keeping the thoughts far more condensed.
Poetry for me is an expression of something that is hard to explain in a medium that's more organized. Poetry tends to be very fluid and creative and jumbled, which sometimes is how we view an idea. So being so abstract, the way that poetry is, makes it easy for us to basically throw onto a page or onto a computer how we feel about a subject, an idea, a concept, something like that, and make it very freeform and have nuances without having to put in as much thought as one would have to for, say, a short story or a film or something like that.
The world around us is not only influenced by poetry, but influences poetry as well. The climate and environmental factors that impact a poet's life will soak directly into their poetry. This is evidenced by decades upon decades of poetry captured and still brought to life through the eyes of history. A close examination of an old poem may act as a window into the past, in which modern-day readers can see how old societies functioned. Where better to begin the search than with one of the most famous and definitely creepiest poets of the 19th century?
From childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of the most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill, the mystery which binds me still, from the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in this autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm, and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view.
Poe's short stories are often focused around death and murder, and his poetry includes darker themes, both literally in dark imagery and metaphorically. His creepy writing voice is iconic, but clearly a factor of his hard life. Aside from struggling financially throughout his whole life, he experienced a lot of death and abandonment. Poe's mother died when he was only 2 years old, and his father abandoned him and his siblings. Edgar Allan Poe's poem Alone captures this trauma perfectly by the very first lines. From childhood's hour I have not been, as others were I have not seen. The abandonment and deprivation of parental affection was clearly an influence on his writing. Similarly, another poet of the century, Emily Dickinson, allowed her writing to be influenced by her society. Dickinson is theorized by many historians to have been an LGBTQ person. She never married, nor had children, though she had a close relationship with her friend Susan. Documented letters between her and Susan reveal that the two lived together often, went on long trips together, and held each other in very, very high regards. Many of Dickinson's poems included Susan's name.
To own a Susan of my own is of itself a bliss. Whatever realm I forfeit, Lord, continue me in this. Come with me this morning to the church within our hearts, where the bells are always ringing, and the preacher whose name is Love shall intercede for us. I chose the single star from out the wide night's numbers, Sue, forevermore. I need her, I must have her. Oh, give her to me. It troubled me as once I was, for I was once a child, deciding how when Adam fell, and yet the heavens held.
Though many historians may argue that they were just roommates,
And they were roommates.
Oh my God, they were roommates.
the longing that Dickinson feels for Susan cannot be denied. Considering that same-sex relationships were not socially acceptable at the time, it is definitely sus how she declares, "Whatever realm I forfeit, Lord, continue me in this," in a poem about owning a Susan of her own. The religious views of her love that society has imprinted on Dickinson are reflected onto her poetry, as she all but denounces a world where she cannot be with the woman she loves. Skipping ahead into the next century, Mahmud Darwish, born in Palestine in 1941, blessed all hopeless romantics with his own wonderfully sappy love poetry.
My lips and fingers were pens on her flesh. I memorized her in every alphabet, and memorized my memories until they multiplied. When I love, I become liquid light. I would split open my own heart with a knife, place you within and seal my wound, that you might dwell there and never inhabit another. They'd ask, "How do you love her to death?" I said, "Speak of her over my grave, and watch how she brings me to life. I long for your hands, two doves that shade the blaze of my longing. And if the devil was ever to see you, he'd kiss your eyes and repent."
Darwish himself has said that classical Arabic literature, Greek and Roman mythology, and Islamic history have all molded his writing style. The first stanza in this poem is even a reworded stanza from an Adonis poem. My lips and fingers were pens on her flesh. I memorized her in every alphabet and memorized my memories until they multiplied. The violent imagery in this poem, about plunging a knife into one's own heart and rising from the grave, may have been influenced by the violence that Darwish witnessed as a child when his village was destroyed during the war that came with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Always taking inspiration from the love stories in Greek, Roman, and Arab history, Darwish has always kept the love in those stories alive in his own poetry. After a deeper look at poetry through the times, I started wondering, how is my own poetry affected by my environment? I looked back at the very first poem that I had ever written for this class, which was given the prompt of imagery. When I wrote this poem, I had the summertime paradise of a nearby waterfall lodged in my mind. As I trudged through grassy bristles, my eyes stare upon the most bewitching still life that nature has ever drawn. Taken aback by my surroundings, so untouched and raw, I ogled upon them, my jaw dropped in awe. The ocean of cattails kissed with morning dew, the Easter egg clouds of the pastel hue, the horizon freckled with lumbering trees, the newly budded field flowers twisting in the breeze, the murky dark water bursting with life, not a glimmer of worry, not a sense of strife, the new day's sun peeking over the hills, the summer trees swaying, flaunting their frills. I looked up from the page, still palpating the lines, a scenic poem that I've read over 3 or 4 times, but it all came to life, the words danced in my head. What a shame that such beauty was so often misread. The very little freedom that I had during the quarantined summer was spent here as often as I could. The little normalcy that I could get during this pandemic had a very obvious impact on the subject of this poem. As for my writing style, I felt an influence from somewhere, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. In this specific excerpt from one of my poems, the rhyme scheme felt oddly familiar. I feel rather helpless to my thoughts. I ought to get caught in the distraught that I fought for so long, like a wing-clipped bird fighting its third flight deterred, and I heard the preferred absurd word that I deferred. I put it off to the side, to sit back and enjoy the ride that is denied to me whenever our worlds collide. I tried to hide the lie or to confide the reply in someone less implied, less likely to hide. I feel rather helpless to my mind. I find that I'm blind to the refined kind of kindness that you give. Please let me live. You know I won't outlive the shiv in my spine, so let me see the stars align, 'cause I'm really into zodiac signs. Then I realized that this particular rhyme scheme was very similar to one found in Hamilton.
I have to resign.
Somebody has to stand up for the South.
Or somebody has to stand up to his mouth. If there's a fire you're trying to douse, you
Can't put it out from inside the house.
I'm in the cabinet. I am complicit in watching him grabbing at power and kiss it. And Washington isn't gonna listen to disciplined dissidents. This is the difference. This kid is out.
The genius of Lin-Manuel Miranda's ungodly rhyming abilities has subconsciously inspired my own writing in a subtle and different style. From the poems of history's most famous writers to my own writing, outside influences have a way of popping up in anyone's poetry. Not even the best writers can escape the influences of the environment around them. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed, and I hope I inspired you to go and look for outside influences in your own writing.